Hey, what's up, everybody? Uh, so I wanted to make a video about, I guess, a fairly contentious topic, which is the issues of sexism and misandry and misogyny in our culture today. Basically, my opinion of third wave feminism, which I entirely disagree with, and I think doesn't need to exist at all. Feminists will cite a wage gap. Okay, that's one thing, but that's not doesn't necessarily even exist. I mean, it just depends on how you look at statistics and things like that. I've heard arguments both ways, and even if it does exist, railing against the attitudes of all men is certainly not a solution. And blaming all men for that is certainly not a solution because it's obviously the action of employers. And most of us are not employers. Most of us are employees, statistically, so that's kind of a weird argument. Even if that is true, which, again, it's not necessarily. Statistics can be manipulated in any number of ways. So, yeah, that's my reaction to the wage gap argument. And aside from the wage gap argument, I can't, again, that being a total non sequitur to the attitudes of all men towards women. See, third wave feminism, to me, is basically an issue of a false cause. So, like women's suffrage movements, like the first and second wave feminism, in my opinions, were far more justified, especially first wave feminism. I mean, and there are certain countries that still need that action, that still are suffering from blatant institutional inequality between men and women, such as in theocratic nations, like a lot of Islamist countries where women are forced to do this or that, or and the world over. I think feminism should focus there, but in today's culture, in industrialized nations, in first world nations, women and men have equal rights on paper, right? And you could argue, well, culturally, there's still some lag, much in the same way that with racism, there's still a lot of lag. If you look at, communities divided by race, where one is rich and white and the other right next to it is poor and black. I mean, how can you sit there and look at that and be like, well, racism doesn't exist in some level, or there isn't some remnant of, racism as a result of slavery 150 years ago? People will say, 150 years ago, that's a long time ago. There's no more racism. Bullshit. Just look around you. Like, you're blind if you live in a bubble if you actually think that. Like, I lived in Boston for a while, and I'll never forget. There was literally a set of train tracks. On the left is Brighton. On the right is Jamaica Plains. Jamaica Plains is poor and black. Brighton is white and rich. And this is everywhere. I mean, look, go to suburbs. I mean, go to inner cities. Like, I don't know how you can look at that pattern and just deny that any kind of racism still exists, and just simply blame, black people. Anyway, it's just totally off the topic, but it's kind of related because I think people who cite some kind of racist element have a better argument or more of a point than feminists today in, like, for instance, America. And I think what it really comes down to, and the reason why it's so contentious, why feminists are so angry, is because I think they're kind of confusing psychological issues, personal psychological issues such as low self-esteem and low self-worth. Well, they're trying to blame that on men, and I think that's where they go wrong. And I don't think they're willing to admit that it really has to do with low self-esteem and low self-image issues. Because once you start blaming other people for your own psychological makeup, you're stuck. And not only are you stuck, but you're causing damage to the people that you're blaming, which happens to be men. And not all women are third wave feminists, but and certainly not all women are radical feminists, who I think are a real problem because they just simply hate men. And I think they're the most extreme example of people that are basically projecting their insecurities or trying to blame their own internal psychological states on an entire group of people outside of them. Because so I basically, it's an issue of false cause. I say that because if in fact that is true, that I'm claiming that the issue really now, whereas it used to be about rights that were not equal among men and women, that was blatantly visible. Women could not vote. These are like concrete things you can look at and be like, that has changed. It's now become so subtle and internal, the complaint I'm talking about, that I'm claiming that it's about internal psychology for women, and women having this idea that their low self-esteem, low issue is a result of the attitudes of men everywhere. And therefore, if they could somehow fix the attitudes of men, they would feel better about themselves. That's the impression I get. That's the feeling I get from listening to feminists in the way that third wave feminists complain about men. And somehow it's all our fault that they have low self esteem. I mean, just think about that for a second. We don't live in an oppressive society. Again, on paper, men and women have equal rights. And I'm saying on paper because I'm granting the possibility that culturally there can be attitudes that are damaging on both sides. And to deny that there is damaging attitudes on both sides, I think is ignorant. You know, so, and I would say the true cause of low self-esteem and low image in both men and women has a lot to do with our existing in a capitalistic society where advertisers are trying to create problems and demand so that they can sell you a product as a solution. So, you know, having these perfect images of people all around you, these beautiful people, perfect bodies, as a, you know, in order to sell clothing or to make you feel deficient in some way so that they can sell you a solution, I think is really significant in terms of forming certain societal pressures that make people feel inadequate. I mean, I think it's relatively insignificant next to more immediate damage, such as having real family issues or really, you know, real bad experiences in the past, as far as, you know, and mental illness being much more potential causes for low self-esteem and low self-worth, right? So take for an example a woman who was sexually abused when she was younger by her mother, or a guy by her father, or a guy that was abused by her mother. I would say the latter example is much less common, although being abused by father for both little boys and girls is definitely more common. But how is that a product of some mentality of, you know, men's attitudes in general? I don't see that generalization as being warranted. Some people are just fucked up and abuse children because they were abused. It's a cycle of abuse. We all know about this. So let's imagine somebody that was abused and grows up with some pretty severe personality disorders, really bad low self-esteem, a lot of anger, such as borderline personality disorder, which often arises from being abused or sexually molested or invalidated basically in some major way, some kind of trauma that, you know, the person can't overcome. And then imagine that person blaming all of that on men. That to me would totally account for some of the behavior we see with radical feminists, but I think in the subtler form it does kind of represent the basic position or the reasoning behind third wave feminism, because I don't think feminism has much to complain about anymore. I think the playing field is pretty even, officially, on institutional grounds. In other words, there are no more structures in place in society that fundamentally differ between men and women. Because you can't do that. Laws don't allow for it. You can't say you can't work here because you're a woman. You can't, like, these kind of structures don't exist anymore. They've been demolished by first wave and second wave feminism. And good. Fucking good, you know? But now it's like they're harping on blaming men, to me, for internal states that they have about themselves that really only they are responsible for. So basically they're disempowering themselves, right? Because if you're blaming internal self-esteem issues on people outside of you, then you've taken yourself out of the driver's seat and you're basically a passenger to your own self-esteem, while filling yourself with this false hope that somehow blaming other people and getting them to change will change you. I mean, that's like the definition to me. It's not, but it's a huge manifestation of like immaturity and an inability to cope with one's own internal states. So attaching yourself to a cause to escape your own internal states. And that's really a problem because it's almost become like institutionalized, and like third wave feminism is like this thing that you can study in school, and like I see it as disempowering for women and damaging to men. And I'm not an MRA because I don't think that I think MRA is basically reactionary against third wave feminism, and both are equally irrational and not necessary. So I'm not an MRA. I don't think it's I understand it to the extent that I think feminism has in some sense damaged men, but I think we damage each other with our expectations. But, you know, so what? They're just expectations. You don't have to buy into them. You don't have to give a shit. That's, again, your responsibility. It's your own low self-esteem that is responding to these expectations as some kind of threat that you need to change. And that's your problem. That's anyone's problem. That's no one else's except that they're, your own problem. If you're gonna consider the expectations of people you don't even know as being more significant than your own beliefs about yourself, that's fucking bullshit. And like, we all need to take more responsibility for ourselves. And I think this culture really fosters an attitude of like, well, we can just blame anyone we want. And I think that's what humanity does, because they don't want to deal with, people just don't want to deal with themselves. They don't want to deal with a damaged past or a mental illness, or, just accept the simple fact that, advertisers are trying to get us to feel bad about ourselves so they can sell us something that'll make us feel good. It's like, from as far as advertising goes, they're manufacturing demand by trying to create a deficiency or perceived deficiency that really may not exist. And I think this is really important. And then again, I think there are better causes for low self-esteem for people. I mean, again, traumatic past with family, friends, getting made fun of, personality disorders that arise as a result, these kinds of things that need addressing on a psychological level. I think they get translated into feminism because people don't want to deal with them. And it's and what's worse, the worst part is that if guys say anything against feminism, then they're sexist. So basically, it's like feminists are allowed to sit there and yell at men and point the finger and tell us that we're bad. And if we go, hey, what the fuck? Well, then we're sexist. Like, really? No. Sorry, that's fucking bullshit. And that's acting like a little child. To me. I hate to be so derogatory, but that does really anger me. That aspect of feminism. And this kind of like, I see men being kind of put between a rock and a hard place, where it's like we're being yelled at by these third wave feminists for being bad just for being a guy, and so what can we do? We don't know, and if we say anything, then we're sexist, and if we sit there, then we're just getting berated for just being a guy, which doesn't make any sense and doesn't do us any good and doesn't do women any good at all. So my final thing to say would be, we need more personal accountability and responsibility, even towards our own past and internal emotional states. We need to take it. Everyone needs to take responsibility for that and not blame someone else for that. It's easy to do when you don't know how to do it, and I understand, because I've been there. You don't know how to handle a past that is potentially traumatic, and that's really fucked you up, and it filled you with a lot of bad beliefs about yourself and things like this. But blaming someone else is the worst thing you can do, because then you're totally taking yourself out of the driver's seat. But it is a way to avoid dealing with the pain directly. So it's almost like feminism is like a drug. It's a way to escape, and so is the MRA movement. To escape internal emotional states that maybe people don't want to deal with. And attaching yourself to a cause always has the effect of kind of getting outside of yourself. Whether it's feminism or some kind of religious movement, or it doesn't matter. I think it's all the psychological pattern is the same in a lot of humans. That's my uneducated psychological analysis of third wave feminism and the MRA movement. I think they both cancel each other out. They're both unnecessary. One is a reaction against the other, but humanism is where it's at now. That's what we need. You can't base a movement of equality, and you can't have a movement of equality and call it feminism. It doesn't make any sense. What we need is humanism at this point, I think. And I'm a secular humanist, but it doesn't matter if you're a secular humanist or not. Humanism, I think, is what we need. Anyway, I would say Mike is free, because I go on Pal Talk and debate, and when you're done, you're supposed to say Mike is free. Anyway, thanks for watching. Peace.